It was late, the kind of night where silence clings to the world like a heavy blanket. Shane, a man in his early 50s, with graying hair and a face that carried years of sorrow, was driving his old truck back home after another long shift at the mechanic shop. The road was deserted, lined with tall oaks that whispered with the wind. His hands gripped the steering wheel, eyes distant, mind heavy with thoughts of a past that refused to let him go. As he approached a curve, the beam of his headlights caught the figure of a young woman standing by her car on the side of the road, a phone clamped between her teeth as she fumbled with the jack. He could see her frustration even from a distance. For a moment, he considered driving past. There was something comforting about the quiet, about retreating into his solitude, but something stirred inside him, something that had long been buried beneath years of self-loathing. He pulled over behind her, honked lightly, and stepped out of the truck. "Got a flat?" he asked, his voice gruff but kind. The woman, startled, turned toward him. "Yeah. Looks like I picked up a nail," she replied, her voice laced with exhaustion. She was young, maybe in her mid-20s, her dark hair tousled from the night air, and her face showed equal parts relief and suspicion. "I can take care of that for you," Shane offered, stepping closer. He could sense her hesitation, the understandable wariness of being approached by a stranger in the dead of night. "I work on cars for a living," he added, trying to put her at ease. After a long pause, she nodded. "Okay. Thank you." As Shane knelt to work on the tire, the woman hovered nearby, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. "Where are you headed at this hour?" he asked, more to break the silence than anything else. "Just back home. Was out with some friends, and I didn't realize the tire was this bad," she said, her voice softening as the initial tension began to ease. "What about you?" Shane smiled faintly. "Work. Just got off a long shift." He glanced up at her. "I'm Shane, by the way." "Abigail," she replied, offering a small smile in return. As the minutes passed and the tire was changed, they found themselves talking more easily. Shane didn't usually open up to strangers, but there was something about Abigail's presence that invited honesty. He spoke in fragments, about his work, the years he'd lost to poor choices, the family he once had but no longer did. He spoke of a wife he'd driven away with his drinking and a son he hadn't seen in over a decade. There was a weariness in his voice, a man weighed down by regrets but still alive enough to keep going. Abigail listened, her expression thoughtful. She didn't say much about herself, only that she was close to her brother and worked in event planning. But Shane noticed the way her eyes softened when he talked about his mistakes, as if she understood more than she was letting on. When the tire was finally fixed, Shane wiped his hands on his jeans and stood. "All set," he said, giving the car's tire a firm pat. "Should get you home safe now." Abigail looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. "Thank you," she said finally. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped." Shane waved it off. "It's nothing. Just glad I could help." But as she drove off, her taillights fading into the night, Shane couldn't shake the feeling that their brief encounter had been more than just chance. Something had shifted in the air, something he couldn't quite name. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Shane's small, run-down house. It was a modest place, more a reflection of his failures than his successes, but it was his, and he took a strange sort of comfort in that. He had spent the better part of the morning tidying up, something he did on his rare day off, part of an attempt to impose some order on a life that had so often felt chaotic. Just as he sat down with a cup of coffee, there was a knock at the door. Shane frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone, and his only friend, Mr. Bennett, his elderly neighbor from down the street, usually came by in the evenings. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Shane set his mug down and made his way to the door, opening it to reveal a tall man in an expensive suit, flanked by two others who stood beside a sleek black SUV parked in his driveway. "Shane?" the man asked, his voice steady, but there was something commanding about his presence. "Yeah," Shane replied cautiously, eyeing the strangers. "Can I help you?" "I'm Anthony," the man introduced himself, extending his hand. "I'm Abigail's brother." "The young woman you helped last night?" Recognition dawned in Shane's eyes, and he relaxed slightly, shaking Anthony's hand. "Right. She got home okay, I hope?" "She did." She couldn't stop talking about the kind stranger who fixed her tire, Anthony said, a slight smile on his face. She asked me to come by and thank you personally. Shane shrugged. It was no big deal. Just helping out. Maybe to you, Anthony said, but to her, it meant a lot. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a white envelope, holding it out to Shane. She wanted you to have this. Shane glanced at the envelope, immediately suspecting its contents. He shook his head and raised his hand in refusal. I can't take that. I didn't do it for money. I understand, Anthony replied, his tone calm but firm. But this isn't about payment. It's a gesture of gratitude. Please, don't refuse it. Reluctantly, Shane took the envelope, feeling the weight of it in his hands. He could tell without opening it that it was more money than he'd seen in a long time, and the thought made him uncomfortable. But before he could argue further, Anthony spoke again. Abigail told me a bit about your conversation last night, he said, his gaze steady. She mentioned you've had some hard times. And she also mentioned something else, that it's always been your dream to work for Golden Leaf Industries. Shane's heart skipped a beat. Golden Leaf was the one company he had always dreamed of working for, a prestigious name in the automotive world. Years ago, before everything went downhill, he had tried to apply but never got past the initial stages. It had always felt like a missed opportunity, a symbol of a life he could have had. I've put in a good word for you, Anthony said, his voice cutting through Shane's shock. There's an opening at the company. It comes with a 3-month training program. They're interested in meeting you, but they'll need your resume. For a moment, Shane was speechless. The weight of the moment settled over him like a heavy fog. He had been stuck in his rut for so long, trapped by the consequences of his past, that he had stopped even hoping for things to change. And now, here was this stranger offering him a chance, out of the blue. I don't know what to say, Shane stammered, his voice thick with emotion. You don't have to say anything, Anthony said, his smile returning. Just think it over. Abigail wanted to do this for you, and frankly, so do I. Sometimes people come into our lives at just the right moment, don't they? Shane could only nod, overwhelmed. As the black SUV pulled away from his driveway, he stood there, clutching the envelope, feeling as if his world had shifted on its axis. The road ahead, once bleak and uncertain, now seemed full of possibilities. The weeks that followed felt like a whirlwind to Shane. For so long, his life had been a monotonous cycle of work, regret, and solitude. But now, everything was changing, so quickly it made his head spin. He had taken Anthony's advice and sent in his resume to Golden Leaf Industries. A few days later, he had an interview scheduled, and before he could even process it, he was walking into the gleaming, modern offices of a company he had admired for years. It felt surreal, like stepping into a dream. The interview went better than he had expected. The team was impressed with his years of experience as a mechanic, and though his resume was unconventional, they seemed more interested in his practical knowledge than his formal qualifications. A few days later, he received the call. He had gotten the job. He was starting a 3-month training program, with the promise of a full-time position if he performed well. The day he got the call, he sat in his living room, staring at his phone, trying to process the reality of what had just happened. He had been given a second chance, a real one. And as much as he wanted to embrace it, part of him couldn't help but wonder if he deserved it. While Shane's career was starting to take off, his personal life remained a source of deep internal conflict. He hadn't spoken to his son, Derek, in years. After his marriage fell apart due to his alcoholism and volatile temper, Derek had chosen to distance himself. Now, as Shane sat in his newly rented apartment, far better than the rundown house he had lived in for so long, he couldn't stop thinking about the boy, now a man, whom he had once failed so profoundly. Mr. Bennett, his elderly neighbor who had become a friend over the years, often came by to share coffee and conversation. Bennett had been the closest thing Shane had to family for the longest time. As they sat on the balcony one evening, watching the sun set over the city, Bennett finally brought up what Shane had been avoiding. So, Bennett began, sipping his coffee, you've got a new job, a new apartment, and a whole new life. When are you going to pick up the phone and call your son? Shane stiffened. He had been dreading this conversation. I don't even know if he'd take the call, Shane muttered, his eyes focused on the distant horizon. It's been too long. Bennett shrugged. Maybe. Maybe not. But you won't know until you try. Shane sighed, the weight of guilt pressing down on him. I hurt him, Bennett. I pushed him away. After his mother left. I wasn't the man he needed. I wasn't anyone he could rely on. Bennett gave him a sympathetic look. We all make mistakes, Shane. But you've been given a second chance, haven't you? Maybe it's time to see if you can start fixing the things that went wrong. The words lingered long after Bennett left for the night. Shane sat in the dark, the phone in his hand, staring at Derek's number. His finger hovered over the call button, but his heart pounded in his chest, filled with fear. What if Derek had moved on? What if his son hated him? Eventually, he put the phone down, too afraid to take that leap. Abigail and Anthony had become more than just casual acquaintances in Shane's life. Over the weeks, the two siblings reached out frequently, inviting Shane for dinner, introducing him to their friends, and slowly pulling him into their world. At first, Shane was hesitant. He wasn't used to people being so kind without expecting anything in return, but it became clear that Abigail and Anthony were genuine. Their warmth was disarming, and soon Shane found himself opening up to them more than he had to anyone in years. Abigail, in particular, seemed to take an interest in Shane's emotional well-being. After hearing about his troubled past, she encouraged him to keep pushing forward. One evening, after a quiet dinner at Anthony's luxurious home, Abigail pulled Shane aside. You're holding on to something, she said softly, her eyes searching his face. Shane stiffened. What do you mean? There's more to your story than you've told us, she replied, her voice gentle but probing. Something that's keeping you from moving on. Shane hesitated. The words hovered on the tip of his tongue, but he had never been good at talking about his feelings. But Abigail's presence, her quiet patience, made him want to try. I hurt people, he said finally. My wife, my son. I pushed them away. I made mistakes I can't undo. Abigail nodded, her expression compassionate. But you're not the same man you were then, are you? Shane shook his head. No. I'm not. Then maybe it's time to forgive yourself, she said softly. And maybe it's time to let the people you hurt see the man you've become. Her words hit Shane harder than he expected. He had spent so long punishing himself for the past that he hadn't considered the possibility of redemption. But now, standing in the warm glow of Abigail's home, surrounded by people who genuinely cared, the idea didn't seem so impossible. Just as Shane began to settle into his new life, a ghost from his past emerged to threaten everything he had built. One evening, as he returned from work, a familiar face was waiting for him outside his apartment building, a face he hadn't seen in over 20 years. It was Lucas, an old friend, or rather, an old partner in crime. They had grown up together, running the streets, getting into trouble, and eventually falling into the same bad habits. Lucas had been there during Shane's darkest days, enabling his worst decisions. Now, as Shane stood frozen in the doorway, the sight of Lucas sent a wave of dread through him. He had tried to leave that life behind, but seeing Lucas brought it all rushing back. Shane, Lucas greeted him, a smirk on his face. Long time no see. What do you want? Shane asked, his voice tense. Just came to check on an old friend, Lucas replied, leaning casually against the wall. Heard you were doing well for yourself. Thought maybe you could help a guy out. Shane felt his blood run cold. He knew where this was going. I'm not in that life anymore, Shane said firmly. Lucas's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. You might not be, but we both know that doesn't mean it's over. You still owe me, Shane. You owe me for all the times I covered for you, all the messes I cleaned up. Shane's heart pounded in his chest. He had been trying so hard to move forward, to leave the darkness behind. But Lucas was a reminder that the past didn't let go so easily. You're going to help me, Lucas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Or I'll make sure everyone in your new life knows exactly who you are. Lucas's return sent Shane spiraling into a world of fear and confusion. He had worked so hard to rebuild his life, but now, the fragile stability he had found was under threat. The pressure mounted each day as Lucas's demands grew more insistent. Shane tried to keep it hidden from Abigail and Anthony, but it became harder to maintain the facade. They noticed his growing tension, the way he flinched at every phone call, the bags under his eyes from sleepless nights spent worrying about Lucas's next move. One evening, as Shane sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at the envelope Lucas had left with him, a knock came at the door. He opened it to find Abigail standing there, her eyes filled with concern. "I know something's wrong," she said quietly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You're not yourself, Shane. Talk to me." For a moment, Shane considered lying, pushing her away like he had done with so many others in his past. But Abigail's steady gaze broke down his defenses. He couldn't hide anymore. "I'm in trouble," Shane admitted, his voice hoarse with guilt. Abigail listened as Shane poured out the whole story, his past with Lucas, the dangerous life they had lived, and the way Lucas was now threatening to ruin everything Shane had worked for. When he finished, Abigail sat in silence for a long time, her expression unreadable. Finally, she looked up at him. "We'll figure this out," she said firmly. Shane blinked in surprise. "What?" "We'll find a way to make this right," Abigail said, her voice strong and unwavering. "You're not alone in this, Shane. Not anymore." For the first time in a long while, Shane felt a glimmer of hope. With Abigail and Anthony's help, Shane devised a plan to confront Lucas once and for all. It wasn't easy. Lucas had always been unpredictable, dangerous, but Shane knew that if he didn't take a stand, he would lose everything. The confrontation came one cold night in an abandoned parking lot, where Lucas had demanded they meet. Shane stood his ground, refusing to let Lucas intimidate him any longer. "You don't control me anymore," Shane said, his voice steady despite the fear pounding in his chest. Lucas sneered. "You think you can just walk away? After everything we've been through?" "I'm not that man anymore," Shane replied. "And I won't let you destroy what I've built." What happened next was a blur, a sudden rush of movement, the crack of fists hitting flesh, and the sharp sound of a gunshot echoing through the night. When the dust settled, Lucas lay on the ground, clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers. Shane stood over him, panting, his heart racing. He had won. But at what cost? Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. Shane had testified against Lucas, who was now serving time in prison for a slew of crimes. It had been a painful ordeal, but it had also brought Shane a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. He had confronted his past, faced his demons, and come out on the other side. As Shane stood on the balcony of his new apartment, watching the sun set, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had a job he loved, friends who cared for him, and a future that seemed brighter than ever. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to pick up the phone and call his son. The road to redemption was long, but Shane was ready to walk it, one step at a time. If you liked this story, please subscribe, like, click the bell, and leave a comment. Thank you in advance.